everybody. Welcome. It's Matt Connarton, Unleashed, live from the studios of WMNH 95.3 FM in downtown Manchester, New Hampshire. Also on Comcast 97 if you're in Manchester. Streaming at WMNHradio.org and on the Facebook on the Matt Connarton Unleashed Facebook page. And today is Wednesday, June 10, 2020. And John Hopwood is here at the news desk.
Hi, Matt.
Hello. Just a quick explanation, because we have a guest who's going to be joining us via phone. Today's going to be a little bit of a different show in that, we had a death in the family, actually just a couple of hours ago. So I'm a little not totally with it. You know, I'm stoic, but I'm not going to, don't worry, I'm not going to break down crying in front of all of you, but I am a little down. So I'm going to kind of turn it over to John Hopwood. For once, I actually won't mind if he talks the entire time.
Yeah, but now that you're putting it that way, I might dry up.
Now you're gonna clam up on me.
You did say once when you needed me to do something.
Oh, I know.
All of a sudden, I just dried up.
Yes.
Didn't talk. Well, Professor Detmer, who is the author of Xenophobia, a book about the backlash against Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States, said he's going to join us at 4:15 Eastern Time.
Yes.
He teaches in Indiana at Purdue East.
Okay. Well, there is someone on the phone. This might be him already if he's early. Hi, welcome to Matt Connarton Unleashed. Who's this?
Yeah, this is David Detmer.
Oh, wonderful. You're early. Okay. Well, I will let... should I play this song in the background here?
He's going to play Phil Ochs' song in your honor.
Yes. We'll play this in the background. This is Love Me, I'm a Liberal by Phil Ochs. But except for some reason, I don't hear anything.
It's going to be one of those days, huh?
Oh, there it is. Yep. Yes. Sounds like the live version.
Oh, it is, yeah.
Yeah, but we can play that in the background. It'll set the mood. But go ahead, John. Go ahead. You can.
Is it indeed in the background?
Oh, it is. Yes. Hear it?
10 degrees to the right of center.
Yeah.
Professor
Detmer, didn't you? Why don't you introduce yourself to the audience here in Manchester, New Hampshire?
So here then is a lesson.
Hi, everyone. I'm David Detmer. I'm a professor of philosophy at Purdue University Northwest. And I'm an author. John mentioned my most recent book is about Howard Zinn and about how so many mainstream historians tried to trash him. And in my book, I try to argue that they make lots of mistakes, and Zinn comes out pretty well in my book.
Can you explain why you have an interest in Howard Zinn?
Well, I was a student of his as an undergraduate in Boston University back in the 1970s. But I always like to point out it's not like, he was my mentor or anything like that, because I was a philosophy major,
right,
and he, of course, was a historian. So I took a couple of classes from him, and I used to go talk to him during his office hours. He was a very nice man, and I learned a lot from him. But like I say, it's not like he was my mentor or anything like that. But I certainly did respect him, and I read his books and admired them. But then also I became a professor at Purdue, and in 2013 it was revealed that the president of my university, Mitch Daniels, when he had been governor of Indiana, he had tried to ban the teaching of Howard Zinn's book, A People's History of the United States, from any public school in the state of Indiana. And so I kind of thought, hey, this is a former teacher of mine, and now it's the president of my university going after him. Maybe I ought to say something about it. And so originally I thought I would just write a short article, but as I researched it, it grew and grew and grew and turned into the book.
Now, Dave, I was a political science major, and Professor Zinn taught in the political science department. And he actually was my mentor, my academic advisor, and I was sitting outside his office, which, Murray was on the other side. Murray Levin was also one of my, mentors there, and somebody I studied with. And I studied both of them at grad school, too, not just as an undergrad. And one day he hands to me the first copy of A People's History of the United States. It had just been published. How many copies of A People's History of the United States have been published in all over the world, Dave?
Yeah, I don't know the actual figure. I know it's been translated into a number of languages. And, of course, Howard also revised it periodically over the years, up until his death in, I think, 2010, if I remember correctly.
2010, yeah.
And as you probably know, there are sort of variants. There's a children's version,
right,
and I think there's kind of an illustrated version. And it's just such a remarkable publishing phenomenon, because the original print run was only 4,000 copies.
It was.
And it has sold well over 2.5 million copies now. And I remember reading that, I don't know if this is still true, but it was true as of just a few years ago, that every single year since it was published in 1980, it sold more than the year before. So just the accelerated rate of sales without any real advertising campaign behind it. So just word of mouth, teachers using it in their classes, things like that. And so it's just really been a tremendous phenomenon.
Now, there's a reason for playing that song, who was a rival to Bob Dylan by the people that don't know Phil. I actually heard about Phil's end from William Kunstler, who, of course, we meet through Howard Zinn, the great civil rights lawyer. You know, he defended Martin Luther King Jr., and he defended the Chicago 8 most famously. I remember that as a kid. It was about 69. I remember, let's forget May right at this point, but it's the best-selling book. But why would we put Love Me, I'm a Liberal? Because Howard Zinn was not a liberal, was he, Dave?
No, he was not. And I think it really is an appropriate song. By the way, before I address your question, I just want to point out I'm a huge Phil Oakes fan. I actually saw him perform back in 1972 when I was 14. And the song Love Me, I'm a Liberal is very much a kind of left-wing critique of liberal cowardice, liberal hypocrisy, and it's very relevant to Howard Zinn in that the historians who have criticized him are not just right-wingers, although the right-wingers certainly did bash him. A whole lot of them were sort of moderate, 10 degrees to the left of center liberals who really, really went after him. And as I'm sure you know, that is a really big divide. You know, people who are sort of mainstream liberals, mainstream Democratic Party types tend to be very resentful of the politics of someone like Howard Zinn.
Arthur Schlesinger Jr. was huge even in my lifetime. You are apparently 10 years older than me, and Schlesinger would be of that liberal school at American, like The Age of Jackson, which is a very good book. And for its time, I read his trilogy of on FDR, and he was the son of a historian. The Age of Jackson won him his Pulitzer Prize, where he equates Jackson with FDR, like an FDR Democrat, because to the liberal historian, history is about progress. And of course, he was Kennedy's what would you call it, resident intellectual at the time. And tell us about that school of the liberal historian.
Well, right. So it was sometimes called the consensus school, where they sort of tried to take the position that there weren't significant political divides in America. There was this consensus, and it's all about progress, the progress of liberal democracy, and so on. Now, the book you mentioned about Jackson, I recall that Howard Zinn, in a couple of his writings, talks about that. And he does say, that he read the book with pleasure. He thought it was a well-written, entertaining book and all of that. But he points out the omissions. How, for example, it says almost nothing about Jackson's very brutal Indian removal policies. And see, that I think also brings up a very important point, and that is the main problem with traditional historical scholarship is not so much getting things wrong, although of course, there are errors.
Yes.
It's much more an issue of omission and emphasis. When you're telling a story, like in history, you don't include everything. You're going to leave some things out, necessarily. Otherwise, you'd be, writing and talking forever. And so sometimes there's a kind of systematic pattern as to what is left out and what is emphasized. And so Schlesinger would be, a case in point where he's just leaving out of his account the Indian removal thing.
Right.
And one other point I want to make about Schlesinger. One thing I noticed when I was researching my book, all these critics who bash Howard Zinn, they would sometimes cite Schlesinger as a kind of, there's an example of how to do history right, where you're not this sort of biased propagandist like Howard Zinn. And one thing that I thought was so remarkable about that is when Schlesinger was this official advisor to JFK, he wrote memos urging JFK to lie, prior to the Bay of Pigs invasion, to say at a press conference, no, the U.S. isn't going to be involved in any kind of invasion of Cuba. And he even wrote a memo on the stationery of Office of the Historian, where he was talking about the kind of lies Kennedy might be able to tell at a press conference.
It's amazing.
And I thought, that's pretty ironic. Someone who is supposedly a historian, and he wants to be involved in the falsification of history as a government official.
Yeah, and let's remember the fact that Schlesinger, who was my family, we always call him Schlesinger. I guess because there was the defense secretary. I'm growing up.
Yeah.
And of course, he won his second Pulitzer Prize in 1966 for 1,000 Days, which was a hagiography, this glowing account of JFK and the administration. 1,000 Days, which left much, much, much out. But that William Manchester, a Marine veteran, who was picked to be, a biographer of JFK in his lifetime, I think by JFK himself, who I remember JFK as a child, and they got along quite well. And then he was asked, because he wrote a book, but then he was asked by Jackie Kennedy to do the official biography of what happened, the death of a president. And I guess the problem she had was that it was too accurate, too truthful, because there's the European version. There's parts from Europe that was published like in Der Stern and that, German press. And here is Arthur Schlesinger, who is also the head of the Americans for Democratic Action, ADA, which was still big when I was at university, the mainstream standard liberals, against McCarthyism, but also against the free speech rights of Dalton Trumbo, a famous essay he wrote where it's all right to circumscribe Dalton Trumbo's right to free speech, a member of the American Communist Party, a member who was under party discipline. But since he was a communist, and if the communists took over, they'd deny us our speech rights. Well, he could be denied that, which is, quite remarkable, but very much within the stream of consciousness of that time. Yeah. One thing, Gore Vidal, I know it only by reading from Gore Vidal, really despised Schlesinger because he led the assault on William Manchester and that book, because they tried to suppress it. It was in everybody's, literate people's house. My parents had a copy of it. In New England, there is literacy. We did have books. My father said back when he was a kid in the 30s, they had two books, the Bible and John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, because they were Protestants. But what do you take on that type of, that Schlesinger, who was probably, wouldn't you say he was like the leading historian, establishment historian, attacking William
he was
Manchester.
certainly among them. I don't know if he was number one, but he was definitely
Not number one,
near the top.
but in the hierarchy of control or power, he had incredible power. Because of his celebrity and who he was. He was famous, and he went against Manchester. I think Manchester had a nervous breakdown because of it, because combat veteran. If you read Goodbye Darkness, a brilliant memoir that Manchester wrote, anybody that suffers like he did, a mortar shell comes in and blew his friend away. That's the only reason he's alive. He actually lived with bone shards of his friend inside his body. That, because you've suffered such a traumatic brain injury, sometimes your memory isn't there. His actual mental health, because of what wasn't recognized then as PTSD, was actually used at him to try run him down. It was quite amazing. And that was Arthur Schlesinger. And about the age of Jackson, I reread it again. It is written, and you can see, it's like justifying FDR New Deal liberalism, and he actually uses the New Deal as a touchstone. As Jackson is the first Democrat, modern Democrat, expanding the franchise, he talks about Roger Taney being appointed the Chief Justice, and that Taney and the Taney Court of Jackson's time being revolutionary for the time in expanding democracy, in that they negated the Hamiltonian Webster ideal that a corporation, once a corporation, that charter is issued, it's eternal. Nothing can happen to it. This is before, of course, the slaughterhouse cases of the 14th Amendment, where they use the amendments to give equity to African American freedmen. They just forget about that and extend citizenship to corporations. But he mentions Taney, as a liberalizer, revolutionizing the court. But he leaves something significant out about Roger Taney, Professor Detmer. Can you imagine what that is?
No, I'm not sure I know what you're talking about there.
Dred Scott. Taney wrote the opinion on Dred Scott, which was one of the most infamous Supreme Court decisions ever, where Dred Scott sued in a court of law that because his master had taken him into a free state, he was free. And generally there were all these customs that you might actually win. There's a word for it, I can't remember, where you manumission, where you went and you can become free.
Where you release the slave.
Right. And Cheney wrote that the Constitution never is not written in a way, does not intend African Americans to have citizenship rights. Since they have no citizenship rights, they have no standing in court, and thus threw that right out. And that was probably the watershed that brings on the what was known at the time after it was consummated, the War of the Rebellion. The United States used to call it the War of the Rebellion, our Civil War. But we're talking about a history that is kind of, cut here, cut there, edited like a movie script or anything to create a narrative arc that we're going to sell. And it's said when you study literature, the great classics like Homer or Virgil have to be translated again by a generation into their language. But history, see, Jackson to me is the FDR liberal under attack now, because there was already a reaction starting in 46 that would later, the second Red Scare that would culminate in McCarthyism. But yes. Now, what was Schlesinger? You're not a professional historian. Do you know anything about his relationship to Charles Beard and that seminal work, An Economic Interpretation of the Constitution?
I'm familiar with Beard, and
right.
I would certainly guess that Schlesinger would reject Beard's argument. but I'm not really a scholar of that.
Right.
Of that. So
can you tell?
maybe you can, tell
well,
me
the
that.
audience, what about Beard? You haven't. Let's. What did you remember from Charles Beard?
Well, he argued that the Constitution, for example, was to protect the economic interests of the wealthy class.
Right.
And in general, it sort of took the view that economic considerations of the wealthy were kind of behind the whole
structure
construction of the government right from the ground up.
Yes, he was, I believe, of the progressive school of historians, but then I think Wilson even, they used to say he was part of it. We'll talk about Woodrow Wilson maybe a little later, our racist president who had a lot to do with defining the Civil War narrative. But Beard had a influence on Howard Zinn and many other what we call them, left-wing historians, non-consensus, that's the best historians, in that this is what a Beardy interpretation would be, that we don't have a parliamentary system. They rejected parliament. They on the idea, party government's awful, because we're all on the same page. We all have the same interest. The United States was not set up as a multiple-party democracy. Rather, it was set up by the Founding Fathers along the modern lines of Mugabe in Zimbabwe and many other African states. The BU had the African Studies Center, too, after you left, Professor Detmer, and that was one of my areas of study. So, like Mugabe...
When were you there, John?
78 to 82. I was there during the strikes.
Well, so we pretty much overlapped. I was 76 to 80.
Oh, okay. Oh, so you were there, yeah. And but like Mugabe and other Africans under the colonial dictatorship, it was a dictatorship. The Africans were only allowed one party. So then you have decolonialization. Oh, suddenly, we want to make a multi-party democracy. No, one party. But the United States, by having no party, we were all one party. In other words, it was a one-party state. Having no parties is the same as one party. We're all in this together. Now, the structure of the Constitution is there. I think this would be a Beardian interpretation, and one Howard Zinn and people like Murray Levin would agree with. I certainly do. The construction of this government with the Senate the way it is, and also the apportionment of representatives in the House of Representatives was based on population, with a proviso, Dr. Detmer, I'm sure you know, that the southern states, for the purpose of apportionment, African chattel slaves were 3/5 of a person. They called that the Negro vote. Thomas Jefferson in the election of 1800, which was contested, it almost led to a coup, and there were 2 state militias in Washington, D.C., when the Electoral College met to make sure that Johnson did not pass the presidency on to Thomas Jefferson's cousin, who is John Marshall, who was his Secretary of State at the time. You create a system where the South had a check on the North, which, if we put it that way, which has a larger population. So it's equalized. There are always, this checks and balances equalizing things, which by the time of the 1850s, culminating with Lincoln's win, the North, which spread out, to Minnesota, greater New England, they call it, into California, overcame the Negro vote. That is, in the Congress, the extra congressmen the South had because they owned slaves, and they'd overcome that. That major check with them to protect their interests it was threatened, and they seceded. And remember, in 1832, Jackson threatened Calhoun, as vice president, with raising an army and going into South Carolina if they dared secede over the tariff of abominations. Now you have the system we have with the Senate. People would argue, like Beard, that it has been constructed to keep a plutocracy, a small ruling class, of then, in the South, agrarian feudal elites, which were similar to the Cavaliers of the English Civil War, and in the North, was a mercantile class then, like the shippers, like John Hancock and them. It was a different economy in the North. To keep the balances, but to keep an elite, a patriarchy, because a patriarchy, the patrician class of Rome. Ancient Rome was one of the big influences on the people that wrote the Constitution. So you have a structure which most white men, only men could vote, but most white men didn't have the vote until the age of Jackson, extended it, because you had to have, there were property qualifications. Women didn't have the vote. Native Americans were not Americans until 1923 or 4. They were foreign countries. African Americans, of course, had nothing really. They did have some standing in court to sue against certain treatment, but that was done away with. So when I was studying with Howard, but I had already read Charles Beard, the idea of the Constitution as a structure, for a small elite to control the country, that was one of the, I'd say, that was one of the realities of his histories, one of the ones of my consciousness, because I was brought up with my father giving me like Charles Beard in the book. And in the 1960s, there was the revolution of both civil rights and against the war. But Dr. Detmer, do you remember the Church Commission?
Oh, absolutely. That investigated the crimes of the FBI and the CIA.
And of what I have argued on this show with Matt, who's younger than me, but I always think that you're not that younger, but
decades
you are.
And decades.
I always think he's older than he is. But I said to Matt, I think one of the things about Donald Trump was a Democrat of his times, and some of this deep state, what would you call it, trope he uses, comes right out of the times of the 60s, and right out of time with the Frank Church, the Church Committee, the Senate hearings into the abuses of the CIA, the FBI, in the command of President Johnson, President Kennedy, and President Nixon. What did they call it? The secret government. I think that's actually in the Church report. It was definitely in the reporting of the times. So here it is. He's born in 46, dodged the draft, and once again, actually got rated 4F. He's exposed to that, where there's this great revulsion against the establishment. There is this brilliant metaphor. One of the best books I've ever read about contemporary history is Norman Mailer. It's called Chicago and Miami and the Siege of Chicago, where I think for Esquire he went and covered both the conventions. And his reportage of the Chicago convention, which I remember being televised, where the police violence against the protesters is amazing. And the metaphor he used is watching outside, his hotel window, because even, he was a tough guy, but he's afraid to get down with the cops rioting, with the smell of tear gas permeating the Hilton Hotel because it got into the HVAC system. And he said, watching the spine of the modern Democratic Party, the fusion between liberals and what Eisenhower called the congressional military-industrial complex, although Ike left the congressional part out. One of his speechwriters said, leave that part out. But the metaphor of watching the spine of this fusion between liberal FDR America as encapsulate, what would it be? The personification is in Hubert Humphrey, one of the great actual liberals of all time, and the military-industrial complex just tearing apart because after Truman, the imperial presidency continued and the roots of the military-industrial complex was laid. Weren't the historians like Arthur Schlesinger pro-war, pro-Vietnam War?
Well, yes, absolutely. Well, actually, that's a little bit complicated.
Yes, like many.
As I recall, later on, we have to draw a distinction between a kind of principled objection to the war and a kind of cost-benefit objection to the war. So later on, as the war became unpopular and the U.S. wasn't winning it, et cetera, I think he came to view the war as a mistake, but he never had any principled objection to it. It's not like he thought, it's an illegal war. It's a war to prevent the people from having self-determination. It's a war
fight
to
communism.
prop up a U.S. puppet dictator. No, he never had anything like that. He wrote about it, how while the war was going on, how desperately important it was for the U.S. to win the war,
yes.
And all that.
Schlesinger was of the school that communism had to be defeated. He bought into the domino theory that if Vietnam fell, then all the Southeast Asian nations would fail, like Thailand, which never did, and their attitude, they totally bought in to that philosophy, anti-communism, and that is rooted in the attack by the Republicans and the reactionaries. And let's remember that the Red Scare of the post-war Red Scare that culminated McCarthyism, much of that force came from the isolationists that had existed up till December 7th, 1941, and still, supported the war. But after the war, they went back to a certain fervor about their type of America, which did not include the New Deal or Truman's Fair Deal. And it's a rather to know all that history. Now, help me out a little here. I'm getting lost in all the minutia. I'm walking through the woods. I can remember details and stuff of everything. Oh, yeah, we're talking about a history. Truman won an improbable victory in 1948. Tom Dewey was thought to be a clinch for the presidency. He faced the rebellion of the FDR left part of the new wing under former Vice President Henry Wallace in the Progressive Party, because Truman was not expected to win that election. But he was inaugurated for his first full term, the first term he won in January 20th, 1949. And in 1949, Mao and the communist forces took China. They defeated Chiang Kai-shek. What people didn't know, because Henry Luce, who owned Time, Life, people don't realize that are younger, Dr. Detmer, how much magazines were a part of life. There was TV, which most people started learning from, but even in our time, it was considered dumbing down the news. You have the great satire Network by Patty Chayefsky in 1976. Then you had the newspapers, but then at the end of a week, you'd get something like the Saturday Review. I remember they had an article about John Silber in the Saturday Review, because
the Teachers and the Tyrant. I remember the title.
Teachers and the Tyrant. But they took a week to digest the news and write about it, rather just in the trenches, the tactics. And then you'd have the monthlies that would come out. I don't remember if Harper's was a monthly or Atlantic. Because my father got, Harper's, the Atlantic. But it was a different, where the news was digested and people had a longer time to deal with things. But Harry Truman was accused of losing China by the Republicans. He was hit hard about that. And they were hit that FDR surrendered Eastern Europe at Yalta because of communist subversion. The anti-communist movement and the witch hunts, which they call them, that brought Nixon to prominence, a much more formidable character than Joe McCarthy. But the idea that the Democrats lost China, LBJ, faced with Vietnam, said he was not going to go through what Harry Truman did and lose that war. Why don't you, in one of the videos I had on my show, was Professor Zinn on a show that Mike Dukakis used to have before he was on PBS in Boston, before he, became governor in 1974. It's called The Advocates. And Howard Zinn, it was about it was like a mock trial where, remember, Hatfield and others would put the Cooper Church Amendment and stuff to defund the war. I saw that in the news so many times as a kid. And, of course, it would always fail. And the deal, people like Tip O'Neill in the House and the senators were offering the anti-war activists of the early 70s was just calm down and we'll get out at the end of 1971. And Howard Zinn rebutted that. And he brought up the Tonkin incident. Can you tell the viewers about the Gulf of Tonkin and the incident that was used to justify?
Well, this was a bogus claim.
Yes.
That a U.S.
ship
had been attacked in the Gulf of Tonkin.
Right.
And it turned out it was a bunch of lies. It was a pretext to then get congressional approval for a massive escalation of the war.
Right. And I want you to know, Dr. Detmer, I actually know somebody from Manchester. I met him up at the VA, a Vietnam veteran who's on the ship that was allegedly attacked. He said nothing happened. There was nothing. So everybody knew that was a lie because we do live in a democracy. Things like Patton slapping two soldiers got out, and it was widely known that was a lie. But he used Lyndon Johnson. Tell us your impression of the war. What year were you born?
My thoughts on the Vietnam War, you're asking?
Well, I'm wondering, when you were born? I was born in 1959. So
I was born in 1958.
Oh.
I'm just a year older than you.
Yeah, I had to take a year off.
Yeah.
I didn't have any money.
I got interested in the Vietnam War at a very young age.
Because it was tough.
And in fact, when the Pentagon Papers were released, I read the 5-volume version that Chomsky was involved with. Was Howard involved in that too? I was almost thinking it was he was involved in that too in the book version.
Yeah, Ellsberg.
So my perspective on the Vietnam War was that
it was illegal.
We have to respect a people's right to self-determination. And so the Vietnam War was essentially a war against that. At the Geneva Convention, this is all in the Pentagon Papers, which I read as a child. There had been an agreement at the Geneva Convention that there would be a ceasefire and an election to unify
Vietnam,
the North and South, which had been separated just arbitrarily for a brief period of time. And the U.S. determined, their intelligence showed that Ho Chi Minh was going to win the election. That wasn't the result they wanted. So the war was to prevent that. And so there's a kind of technical sense in which you could say, well, the U.S. was defending South Vietnam against North Vietnam, but that's really misleading because
Yes.
that just means that's only true if what you mean by South Vietnam is the South Vietnamese government, but that was a puppet government
Yes.
established by the U.S. So one of the things that I find really remarkable about our country is, on the one hand, in one respect, it's very free and open, and that has to do with the access to information. So here you have Daniel Ellsberg leaking this secret history of the Vietnam War,
which was
top
created,
secret document.
Created for the
And
Pentagon.
the courts upheld that newspapers had the right to publish that and so on. So that's the good part. The bad part is it doesn't seem to penetrate popular consciousness at all. The Pentagon Papers established that the whole government story about the Vietnam War was a lie. It was a cover story. But the cover story is pretty much what you still hear today. So, like, for example, did you see that movie that came out a couple of years ago? What was it called? Was it called The Post? That one with Tom Hanks and... yeah, go ahead.
No. This is the first time
you didn't see that. It was a movie about the publication of the Pentagon Papers.
Oh, it made Catherine Graham, the great hero, where it was the New York Times that went with the New York Times. No, I didn't want to say it because I can't really watch history movies because I know all the details. See, I'm trying to...
Sure. Yeah, you're right. The Times did, but the Post did as well.
Oh, yeah.
But in any case, here's what really made me mad about the film. I mean, it was well acted and all that. Well,
Meryl Streep.
From a standpoint of an entertaining story, it was fine. But the history, there was a problem with it. They did emphasize the idea that the government had lied about Vietnam, and the Pentagon Papers showed that. But really, the only thing they talked about in detail was the idea that the Pentagon Papers said that there was really no chance of the U.S. winning the war. So the idea was, well, no president wanted to end the war because they didn't want to be the one responsible for having lost it. They wanted to keep it going until the next president was going. And so the whole implication was, that was the lie, as if we would have won the war, it would have been just fine.
Oh, that's obscene.
So there wasn't anything about this whole business about how, it was a war to prevent the people from having self-determination. It was a war fought because we were reneging on an agreement at the Geneva Convention. It was a war that was against international law. It was a war fought because we couldn't accept the idea that the wrong person was going to win. None of that really came out.
Right. I just want to give the people a background in that Vietnam was part of French Indochina, was part of the French Empire. You could speak French in Hanoi or Saigon. It was a part of the empire, and in 1941, because France capitulated to Hitler in June of 1940 in a spectacular collapse. And then Marshal Pétain or as I would call him as a kid, Pétain. And in my neighborhood, they have the French generals of World War I. They named streets after them. It was a French-speaking neighborhood, Quebecois. But Marshal Pétain created the collaborationist government, Vichy France. And there was a great deal of tension because the French troops did not want to go over with the Allies. De Gaulle was not that popular, and people barely knew him. In Syria, they actually fought the Allies. They fought the Allies a bit in North Africa. And so technically, French Indochina, which would be Cambodia too, and Laos, were under the Vichy French. But the Japanese seized it when they started, the massive expansion that took Indonesia from the Dutch and threatened Australia. That was part of the beginning of World War II in the Pacific. So, in 1945, they're defeated. What do we do with French Indochina? Well, we give it back to the French, which Franklin Roosevelt, who died and never got his never got. Number one, he never got to write his history, so Churchill did, and Churchill lied many times to make himself the one who made the critical decisions. And FDR was committed to anti-colonialism as his philosophy. The only two major arguments he ever had with Churchill, one of them was over Gandhi and neo-colonialism, and because of India was part of the British Empire, and it was very soft because it was a colonial possession, and there were very few British troops there. So they had a fight over that the United States wanted, because the United States went in with bases. We had a lot of air bases there, said that we're going to guarantee the independence. And self-determination was part of Franklin Delano's post-war platform. It was Roosevelt that was behind the United Nations, and he never lived to. It's like Lincoln. They never got to be in the post-war era, but so France is giving back the Vietnamese, is giving back Vietnam. They had retaken Algeria, and the Algerian War, which was genocide, started on VE Day 1945 because they'd already gotten it back. And a demonstration in Algiers by Arabs for democracy, independence, self-determination, part of the propaganda that the Allies gave so that they didn't go over to the Germans, was suppressed by French artillery and planes, and the massacre of people that led to a long civil war that with 1/9 of the Arab population dying in Algeria before they won their independence. So the French have Algeria, but they also have Vietnam, and there's a man named Ho Chi Minh who took George Washington as his hero and who had expected the United States to support him in making an independent nation. And
there in the Pentagon Papers,
Yeah.
there are a number of letters that he wrote to the United States
Yeah.
asking for support, and he was very inspired by the United States Declaration of Independence and quoted it and so forth.
And he is the man who is the George Washington of that country because he led the Viet Minh in their opposition to the Japanese, which is, amazing. So what happens is the Vietnamese under Ho defeated the French army, including their elite paratroop units and the French Foreign Legion. JFK visited Vietnam, I think, in 53 or before Dien Bien Phu, and in 54, and saw the Legionnaires and the Legionnaires who what are they? What they? There's a name for them. It's escaping me right now. I get lost in details. That's why Matt has to really rein me in. But he saw all these people and thinking, if these elite troops, these professionals, cannot hold on to this country, how are we going to be able to do it? There were French conscripts. The famous French actor Alain Delon was drafted and sent to Vietnam and wound up in. He had funny stories about it, but it culminates in the French colonial control over Vietnam, ends at Dien Bien Phu during a siege, where the French are reduced, and the French asked Eisenhower for air power to send in the new B-52s to save the troops that were surrounded. These elite troops that couldn't win against this guerrilla army any more than like Chiang Kai-shek could, or the Japanese win against Mao's guerrillas in China. And Eisenhower refused. Nixon wanted it to go in. And so they lost the French. The French lost Indonesia. They went to Geneva for the peace treaty. The United States pledged to self-determination. The country was divided temporarily, right? And then there was supposed to be a unifying election. And then you learn from Howard Zinn, I learned from Howard Zinn, that it wasn't the Ho Chi Minh that didn't want the election. It was the United States that abrogated it. Put in, what was his name, Tu? No, Tu was the guy.
Well, first
Diem,
it was Diem.
Diem, a Catholic in in a nation that had few Catholics but were privileged because of the French. French were Catholics.
By the way, if I could just cut it and make one point with regard to DM, and this is a callback to Phil Oakes at the beginning of this. Phil Oakes had a very early song about Vietnam. I mean, it came out in like 1962 or 1963, and one of the lines was, "We're fighting to keep Vietnam free for good old democracy."
Oh, I always
democracy. That's rule by one family. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I see Diem. Some people I've heard pronounce it Ziem because the D, our transliteration. So Diem, D-I-E-M. He was virtually the dictator of Vietnam. You can read Graham Greene, The Quiet American, a great novel about American interference there. And what happened to Diem in November of 1963, just shortly before the assassination of JFK, it might have been in October, that led Vice President Lyndon Johnson.
He was assassinated himself.
Right. And Lyndon Johnson said, when he became president, or it could have been even when he was vice president, because there were other assassinations carried out under Kennedy, weren't there, Professor Detmer?
I'm sure there were. Yeah. They tried to assassinate Castro.
Right.
Yeah, there certainly where this came out in the Church Committee report that you alluded to earlier.
Right, and the LBJ reportedly said we were running a goddamn murder incorporated. And my friend Mac, who was a African American born in 1923 in Cape Fear County, North Carolina, into legal peonage, Dr. Detmer. He was born as the son of a sharecropper. He was a very intelligent man, and he got to go to segregated teaching college for colored people. So he's going to become a teacher. But the war comes around, and R.J. Reynolds says to his father, "We want him back on the farm." Because cigarettes are big business, and they had a contract to make cigarettes for the troops. So they went down to the African-American, or at the time colored, lawyer, because communities like that were segregated had their own lawyers, doctors, even hospitals. Colored people need not come into the white hospital, right? And I'll never forget what Mac told me, because he said the lawyer told the father and Mac, if I had to choose between fighting Adolf Hitler or fighting R.J. Reynolds, I would fight Hitler. So he enlisted in the army. He had a unique career, and he wound up in the communications department at the White House. And he told me he brought a cable to JFK, to the Oval Office, that said Castro had been assassinated. A flash cable. Of course, it wasn't true, but he had many great stories. In fact, I'm in one of Roger Stone's books, where Stone accuses LBJ of killing Kennedy, because I used to tell him some of the stories. Yes, I knew Roger Stone. But what do we murdered our own dictator, and then there was a succession of military generals more incompetent than each other that took over in Vietnam. You had the Buddhists, who had a Buddhist population. We had, as a kid, Life magazine, and a Buddhist monk pouring petrol over himself, gasoline, and setting himself on fire. I mean, we were defending a regime that was utterly corrupt, and I worked on a Time Life series of books when I was at BU at a small Boston publisher that were doing it freelance. I was shocked. By the time the United States ratcheted up in either 63 or 64, with the big build-up coming in 65, 93% of all of Vietnam, South Vietnam, aside from the city of Saigon, Hue, and Da Nang, where, there was big populations of military troops, 93% of Vietnam was under the control of the Viet Minh. At the time, they called that the Viet Cong. In fact, we were there to stop the people from self-determination, weren't we, Professor Detmer?
Absolutely. That's exactly what it was about. By the way, I was in Vietnam last October for a conference. I gave a paper at a conference there. It was in Ho Chi Minh City, the former Saigon.
Saigon.
And I on a day off, I went to some touristy sites, and one of the ones I went to was the War Remnants Museum. Their big museum about the war, which of course they call the American War. They don't call it the Vietnam War, obviously. They call it the American War. And one thing that really impressed me, it was a very impressive museum, and one thing that particularly impressed me is that the exhibits clearly distinguished between the U.S. government and the American people.
Yes.
And they talked at great length. There was an entire gallery about the U.S. anti-war movement and talked about how important that was in ending the war, and talked about how the American poor and working class disproportionately suffered. They were the ones who fought and died and were maimed, and they were the ones who disproportionately suffered economically from the great cost of the war and so on.
Right.
And I just thought that was remarkably sort of generous and sophisticated, rather than just sort of hating all Americans indiscriminately. They were able to draw in the museum, able to draw a distinction like that.
Dr. Detmer, friends of mine who are Vietnam veterans, one of the most healing things that they can undergo is to go back to Vietnam. And what they tell me is the Vietnamese have great nobility of soul, a great nobility of heart, because they consider the American military personnel, the soldiers and the Marines that they fought as victims of American imperialism and of the American government, and they're incredibly warm people. It's such a healing thing for the vets to go, but it's very difficult to make that decision to go because of the horrors that they were exposed to. And among the Vietnam vets that I go, I've been in group therapy, which is a privilege. I was like one of the only non-combat vets, like when the group I was in. You can tell when they were in Vietnam, because if they don't hate Lyndon Johnson, then they hate Nixon, But we want to get on to civil rights, but we have Howard Zinn wants to break through the propaganda of this consensus history that sells the war, that sells a racist society or whatever, and he was intimately involved with the Vietnam resistance, and then we'll go to what he was involved with before that. Was he not?
Absolutely, yeah. He is someone who certainly he gave speeches about the Vietnam War at the Boston Common. There's a very famous speech he gave. I'm sure you've seen the documentary video. You Can't Be Neutral on a Moving Train. Same title as his memoir, and it has some footage of him speaking at the Boston Garden. So he gave talks. He participated in rallies in civil disobedience. He, at one point, made a trip to Vietnam to
take the release
some American servicemen and bring them back.
In '68.
Yeah, he was very, very active.
The thing about Howard was, people don't know, he was a bombardier on a B-17, a flying fortress. One of the events of his life that really affected him, because he was a tremendous critic against the bombing of North Vietnam, which most reasonable people would consider a war crime, and the bombing of civilians before it was legitimated by the victors of World War II was considered a war crime. Robert Lowell, the great poet, and others refused military service because of the brutality and the war crime that they considered the bombing of civilian populations, strategic bombing, not tactical bombing of military units, but of destroying, killing civilians, particularly working class civilians, that would just sap the strength of the country. It didn't do it. It didn't do it in Nazi Germany, and it didn't do it in Vietnam, where we dropped more bombs. But in I think it's April 1945, I used to talk to Howard about two veterans, And my brother was an Air Force veteran. We used to talk about he was stationed at DIS, which was DISS, a base in England. But in April 1945, the war is over. There are French in a French town. There are German troops. They're not Nazis. They're German troops waiting to surrender for the right time. And they had just been introduced napalm. Now, maybe it came from old Curtis LeMay himself, because they'd used I don't think they'd used napalm yet in Japan. They just used the incendiary bombs, which killed in one raid on Tokyo far more people than the bomb on Hiroshima. And those were civilian lives lost, men, women, children, which anybody...
Can I make a comment about
that? Go
ahead. Have you seen the film The Fog of War?
I have tried to. I actually know. There's another person I know, Errol Morris. Yeah, I've been watching it, but it's hard to take.
I've
it
seen
is
that.
hard to take. I was just going to quote one part of it that made a big impression on me, is that McNamara referred to the very event you're talking about, and he said it so bluntly. This is close to word for word as I remember it. He said something like, Tokyo is a wooden city. We decided to set it on fire. We decided to burn to death 200,000 Japanese, men, women, and children.
Civilians.
And I thought, that's really quite a remarkable thing. There are different ways of defining terrorism, but usually the central element is you're deliberately attacking non-combatants for a political purpose. I mean, that's why people were so horrified by 9/11, for example.
Yes.
And, here it is. You've got this high government official. As you know, he later was defense secretary during the Vietnam War. And he's saying, we deliberately decided to burn to death civilians, men, women, and children, as a war tactic.
Well, talking about McNamara, I met Daniel Ellsberg once again through Howard Zinn during the strike, by the way. Remember when, I don't know if you went to the rally with Ellsberg, and I actually organized that one. And Ellsberg was a former Marine, worked for the Rand Corporation, a Republican. He taught at Harvard. I didn't realize he was an expert on the use of nuclear weapons, and there is a Ellsberg paradox. Knew Henry Kissinger very well, who once again made his reputation dealing with the logic and strategy of nuclear war. And he was said that 1967, he saw McNamara was there and admitted to him that the war was lost, but he wouldn't stop it, and which is an absolute. They absolutely didn't, Dave? They sold the idea, like the Westmoreland, one of the worst generals. I've been watching stuff about him now, about how incompetent he was, and how Johnson was an incompetent war leader. Unlike Lincoln, he didn't get rid of a bad general. He just let them go, They knew the war was lost. The defense secretary knew the war was lost. And that's when Daniel Ellsberg copied everything. You know who he tried to give the information to? He went to see Henry Kissinger, his fellow professor or researcher from Harvard. I don't know if Daniel Ellsberg was ever a professor, but which Dr. Kissinger was. He goes to see him. I think it was at Key Biscayne, because he wants to get Nixon has been elected. This has been Johnson's war. This has been the war of the Democrats. I've heard Vietnam vets said, those liberals, they sent me off to that war. I hate liberals. Because that whole thing, self-determination, whatever. Just think, Matt, that this aggression, which most people consider genocidal, was in the name of liberalism. And, so he went to Henry Kissinger, and they had a talk. He says, here it is. You can get out of this war, which they know was lost. Nixon can blame LBJ. Stop the war. Stop it. And you take the credit. And he said Kissinger was different. Suddenly he's the advisor to the president-elect. And he says he never got to see Nixon. The closest he got to Nixon was Nixon and Bibi Rebozo, his financially shady pal, going by in golf carts. That's when he went to people that he was opposed to. A Howard Zinn, who was already a well-known activist, by going to Hanoi to release those two pilots, and Noam Chomsky, who was a friend, a professor of linguistics at Harvard. They were one of a group of groups that had copies of it to hide it in case one group got arrested. The other group would have copies. And the New York Times and the Washington Post, the New York Times went first. Then they get sued to stop. So then the Washington Post does the next one. Then they get sued. And if it wasn't the Warren Court, the remnants of the Warren Court, God knows what would have happened. But getting back to Howard, they ordered his unit. They loaded it with napalm, and they bombed the town and killed the Germans and civilians. The French to this day are very bitter about a lot of the bombing that was done in Normandy and after Normandy in the war. Because the 8th Air Force, which he was part of, you should see the graves, Dave, in East Anglia. So many people died. And Howard told me every day, he said to himself, that poem by Randall Jerry about the death of the turret gun, the turret gunner. And so when he's dealing with this war, he has to deal with his guilt and memories of murdering people. That's what it is. Dropping napalm on people. There was no need for it. But as Ellsberg realized, Nixon and now Kissinger were on a train. That train has its momentum. It just keeps going. So rather than end that war and end in glory, that wind up killing almost as many Americans as LBJ did, and killing probably more Vietnamese with the bombings of Hanoi at that time were war crimes. The mining of the harbor at Hanoi was a war crime because this simple thing that Howard Zinn brought up time and time again, there was no declaration of war. It was an unconstitutional, illegal war. And, Trump was actually part of that generation. Oh, no, you go ahead.
I was just going to say, going back to the napalm thing, and this also goes to the issue of a war crime. You mentioned Chomsky. You're probably familiar with the famous book Manufacturing Consent.
Oh, yeah.
And
all his
in
books.
the revised edition, in the foreword to that, they give an example. I don't have it in front of me, so I'm not going to be able to cite the statistics precisely. But they give a good example of a systematic pattern of omission in reporting.
Yes.
And so it was a study that was done. They looked at, I think, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, the LA Times, papers like that. And they looked at every single article during the Vietnam War that mentioned napalm or Agent Orange. And it was, I don't know, like 11,000 or something, some huge number of articles. And exactly three out of like 11,000 mentioned that this was chemical warfare. And one of them pointed out that that's contrary to international law.
Well, they dropped.
So it's got this thing where they're not lying. It's just they're not talking about they're not talking about a very relevant truth.
Dave, they're using an objective history. Oh, they dropped the bomb, as Howard says. One of his Vietnam era appearances. They're dropping anti-personnel devices that explode.
Yep.
And what do they call it? Flechettes or something? It'd be the equivalent of a bomb that went out with nails or something on civilian populations. Men, children, women. They have the famous picture of that young Vietnamese girl naked in agonized pain, naked because it had burned her clothes off. Napalm is a form of like jellied gasoline, you could think of it, that stuck to the flesh. It was a war crime. They were committing war crimes. War crimes. It's just amazing that after Nuremberg in the United States, talking about the Nuremberg principles and everything, to end the war was considered broadly genocide. You know, we could talk a lot about that because you could go into 1967. There's a book published about who's the great mathematician? You're a philosopher. The great Bertrand Russell, the Russell Commission against the crime of silence, that they'd been remaining silent. So many GIs were coming back and say, we're free fire zones. That means we're killing every man, woman, and child. Because folks, if you are thinking about going in the military, that's what you're going to do. You're going to kill men, women, and children. Audie Murphy went through it in World War II. You kill men, women, and children. And the guys never get over killing the kids because, like my brother, I have pictures of him in Liberia. You're 13, you're an adult. You're a young soldier. You're a soldier, whatever. But, yeah, and so Howard, the objectivity of history and reporting was kind of offensive to him on that front. But much before that, the young historian Howard Zinn went to teach at Spelman College, a woman's college for Negroes, which was the polite term at the time, which people like Malcolm X and Elijah Muhammad, who was head of Nation of Islam, the so-called Negroes. I'll never forget that because Howard had us read the autobiography of Malcolm X, whereas in high school we had read Black Like Me, where isn't it terrible that a guy that pretends he's black gets treated this way, rather than a black person getting treated this way. And, I never had thought about stuff like that. But he's teaching his African-American women students and in a school that's actually funded by the Rockefeller family, who had a great commitment to funding, the United Negro College Fund. Because the GOP, the Republican Party, was supposed to be the party of Negroes. My friend Mac was a Republican to the end of his life, which always his daughter, his son-in-law, me. It's like, how can you do it, Mac? Because, and because he hated Southern Democrats, that's why. And, stories I can tell. We'll bring you on my show. I could tell you plenty of stories. But he's at Spelman College. One of his students is a future Pulitzer Prize winner, Alice Walker, who loved Howard, adored him. And tell us about that experience. Howard Zinn starts to teach young African-American women about history at Spelman College.
Sure. So yeah, that was his first major academic job. He had his PhD from Columbia University, and they hired him at Spelman College to be the chairman, I think, as I recall, of the history department. And you're right, he had a number actually of prominent students. You mentioned Alice Walker. There's also Marion Wright Edelman is another one. But one thing that's interesting is that his students began to participate in acts of civil disobedience in Atlanta. And a lot of people take it as, Howard Zinn sort of led them to do that. But he always insisted that that's not so.
Yes.
That they did it, and he merely supported them. He was their advisor. But they did a lot of interesting things. One of my favorite things that they did is at the start, the public library in Atlanta didn't allow blacks.
It was completely segregated?
So his young students would go in and request a book, and I thought this was a nice touch. It would often be a philosophical book on freedom. It would be something like John Stuart Mill's On Liberty or something like that. And they'd be, ushered out, no, get out of here. But very quickly, they then, they did allow African Americans into the library. And then similarly, they would do things like do sit-ins at segregated lunch counters.
Right.
And this appeared to be very effective. A lot of these these restaurants changed their policies, got rid of segregation. But the president of Spelman College, I want to say his name was Manley, if I remember correctly, didn't approve of that. He was African American,
right?
But he was much more conservative. Didn't like the idea of the students being involved in civil disobedience.
Alice Walker
and
says
so at one
they were
point,
raised
Howard
to be ladies.
Zinn was abruptly fired. and no explanation was given. So Howard asked, what's the grounds for termination? And Manley said, it's not my policy to have to give any grounds. So, he was fired, but he then landed on his feet and got the job at Boston University,
where he became very well known. I went to BU. I only applied to BU. I wanted to be here with Howard Zinn. He was so well known in this Boston area. I didn't realize until I moved to California he was famous throughout the United States. I'm sure the people's history had a lot to do with it. And if you can tell me, like, I get towards quarter of, we got to talk about the people's history as a teaching aid. But, Alice Walker says we were supposed to be ladies, to the black bourgeoisie. Let's remember Atlanta, where my father lived. I went there in the 70s to visit him, was the home of Dr. Martin Luther King Sr. and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who were members of what we call the black bourgeoisie. William Kunstler had a funny story. He told us that he was at a march down south with Martin. He had the right to call him Martin. I don't know why I am. Dr. King. And they wanted him to pose with cotton because there were cotton workers. And he didn't really want to do that. And I guess, I don't even know if there's no picture because they probably got rid of it. And he said, here's Martin in his, his shark skin suit. He's never had to work in his life because he was born into this family and they were preachers. And that is a very significant thing in the African American community where so little is offered. It's almost like medieval times, Dave, where, if you didn't get the fortune, you went to Oxford or Cambridge for an education to become a divine, to become a priest. That's what Jude the Obscure, he never does get there. And so that was a major thing, like Adam Clayton Powell Jr. and his father. They're major pillars of the community. You're not allowed anything else. That was one of the things. But then you think about the moral suasion they had. Because in any southern town, like a white southerner told me, born into grueling poverty in Sunflower County, Mississippi, the hierarchy in any southern town is, number one, the Baptist preacher. Number two is the high school football coach. And the sheriff or the mayor might be next. Depends, right? So you have Martin and Bill Kunstler. So it's funny to him because you're associating like he's there to help sharecroppers and everything, but he's a remarkable man because I think about him every day. Like when I was at the rally yesterday, he certainly died for me. I believe that. But Howard said that he was faced by teaching these young African American women the consensus history by people like Arthur Schlesinger, where they're arguing whether, Jackson was a liberal and over the Second Bank of the United States, and whether Whig philosophy, this stuff. And he said this had nothing to do with their lives as being led. But the interesting thing about people saying that he, he was a Pied Piper for somebody like Alice Walker was, we see that even in my town. We don't talk about my town here for certain reasons, retaliatory, but we can't get into that. Is the idea that a white person mentoring like a young black person, and Howard, I'd want you to talk about SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, that a white person being a mentor to a black person is they're controlling them, they're an agent controlling blacks, and blacks have no agency at all. When I came back here after 32 years, I could not believe an argument like that was being made. It's like you might as well be Montgomery, Alabama in 1954. They can't think for themselves. They can't do this themselves, which is such a lie. And we heard that always about Dr. King. Can you tell us about the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee?
Well, they were a very important civil rights organization in the South, African American organization, mostly young people.
Right.
And Medgar Evers was involved with them.
Who's in the song, got
He
killed.
was assassinated. And Howard Zinn participated in some of their activities, and he wrote a book about it. It's a very important book. One criticism that a lot of people make of Howard Zinn is they say, well, he didn't really do sort of original primary source research. He sort of would, get his material from other scholars and fashion a narrative out of it. But there are cases where he did do highly original primary source scholarship, and this is a really good example. His book on SNCC, where he interviewed the people involved, personally witnessed a lot of their activities, did archival research, and so on. So it's a very important book.
And what was the level of violence faced by civil rights activists, young Negroes, which, that's the word I grew up with, and our newspaper publisher, William Loeb here, always put it in a small N, and just the stuff I grew up with, let's not even get into that. What does the level of violence faced by somebody, because my father told me in Georgia in the mid-'60s, a black person could be shot and killed with impunity by a white man, face no consequences at all. So he knew a case of that happening. What's the level of violence?
Yes, absolutely. Tremendous amount of violence. I've also read that basically a white man could demand sex from a black woman and do that without any kind of consequence and so forth. So, yeah, it was a tremendous system, and so people involved in actively resisting it were very much putting themselves at risk. Many were killed. Many were savagely beaten. People who participated in
the Freedom
protest
Riders,
events of any kind, whether it's a rally or some kind of freedom ride on the buses or sitting in a lunch counter, they might be beaten not only by civilians but by police.
But organized mobs of white people, the civilians were always there organized, just like you see these certain people with their guns, like Oath Keepers and that, with the BLM. It's like flashing back to then where you had white gangs ready to beat people, and the sheriff and the police looked the other way. And we have to remember when James Meredith was the first black student at the University of Mississippi, Ole Miss, he had to be accompanied by federal agents, and a white mob launched a small insurrection where two of the, I was going to call them crackers, two of the protesters on their side were killed because they came with deer rifles.
Yeah.
This is a history that
again,
stopped being taught.
I keep wanting to make these callbacks to Phil Oakes, since you talked about him at the beginning of the show. He wrote a song about that, and I remember one lyric was something like, "Listen, Mr. Barnett and Mr. Walker too, the times are changing mighty fast, they'll roll right over you. One day you'll go to the south, to the southern tip of hell, and it's hot down there, white hot down there, let's hear your rebel yell." So, yeah, it was tremendous violence, even for something like getting a black student into the University of Mississippi.
Right, and in 1964, at the convention where LBJ expected to be crowned, and the only drama is if Bobby Kennedy would be his vice president, or, who was going to be his vice president. Fannie Lou, can you tell us about Fannie Lou Hamer? Hamer.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Fannie Lou Hamer. Tell us about Fannie Lou Hamer and seating delegates at a Democratic convention coming from the South, which was controlled by white racist Democrats, the Solid South.
So first of all, as I recall, wasn't she someone who got beaten up and badly abused? With regard to that delegation, is that the one where they refused to seat the delegation and Julian Bond was involved, or am I mixing up two different things?
Mississippi Freedom Democrats because blacks weren't allowed to vote. Dr. King and them, they're trying to register people to vote. The Civil Rights Act in 1958, which Lyndon Johnson got through, the first one in since Reconstruction. Ike wanted that. He wanted black people to be able to vote in the South, so they vote Republican, even though as his presidential candidate, his popularity, he won the South. He won Texas twice, which is one of the reasons LBJ wound up on the 60 ticket. That's one of the, as I've told Matt, when in Atlanta, in Georgia, when Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested, and to avoid being served the writ of habeas corpus, I think it was in Atlanta, or it might have been outside, the police kept moving him between jails, and Coretta Scott King, his wife, and thought he was going to be murdered. And this is during the 1960 presidential campaign, and his father, who was a powerful voice in the African-American community, had endorsed Nixon. They appealed to Nixon to say something, and he refused. Ike always thought that was something stupid, and JFK did extend it to him, and they managed to serve the writ of habeas corpus, because he was already famous by then, King, for becoming one of the faces of the civil rights movement. And then King's father endorsed JFK. You know, because of the white resistance to civil rights, when in 1960, Republicans never won in the South except for Ike because of his popularity as, the crusade in Europe, 5-star general. He was greeted by such an enthusiastic crowd in Atlanta, he thought he might have a chance to do what Ike did and pick up some southern states. And so he did not help Dr. King. And ironically, Dave, when the votes were cast and the Electoral College, Georgia was for Kennedy, and the only other state that had a higher percentage of voters for the Democratic electors, which were Kennedy, was Rhode Island, which was the most Catholic state. So he miscalculated that year, but in 68 and 72, he compensated. Yeah. But such a history. See, what Howard Zinn is to me is to talk about the reality of what is, rather than this middle-class fantasy of a mission where you create politeness. Even before I met Howard Zinn, I realized that politeness was the oil of the middle class that kept a lot of the oppression going. Oh, we can't talk about, the sexual abuse of girls in a family. We can't talk about this or that. Wouldn't be polite. People wouldn't feel good. Well,
in university life, the big term now is civility.
Right.
And in the abstract, one can argue that civility is a good thing. If you have a disagreement with someone, it's best to be able to discuss it calmly and rationally and not yell and do name calling and all of that. So, in principle, that all sounds good. But the way it tends to work out in practice is people in power can do just outrageous things, criminal,
right
unconstitutional
here.
things
Yeah.
that are unfair, that deprive people of their rights. And then if you try to call them on it in those terms, oh, you're being uncivil. We can't have that.
And it's part of the general overall conformity. I mean, McCarthyism was embraced by the American public. It was, anti-communism was very intense. We have people here. I can't believe. Here I am. It's 2020. People hauling out communists. I get the BLM kids here. They've never met. Were these beautiful kids. And, Dave, when you talk to them, they understand racism. They expect racism here in New Hampshire, the last state to have a civil rights day, last state in what happened, the development after the federal Martin Luther King holiday. We're the last ones to have a civil rights day, which is amazing when you think about places like Arizona, Barry Goldwater's home, and the last one to name it after Martin Luther King because they wouldn't. And all the articles of the period say, oh, contrarian New Hampshire, independent New Hampshire. No, it's racist New Hampshire. Racist. This state here, which never has confronted its racism and which has this outlandish role in picking the president, which I consider the Iowa caucus and New Hampshire primary, two of the most least ethnically diverse, two of the most white states. I consider that they're the gatekeepers is a form of racist gerrymandering. There's no doubt in my mind about that or why, because I keep asking myself, why and is the New Hampshire primary still exist? It serves a function. But it's impolite to ask about that.
I've never really understood. I mean, if we're going to have this system where the primaries are all spread out, where you just do, one or a few states at a time, why is it always the same states that get to go first? You would think it would rotate or something.
The Democratic Party
because,
and Republican Party
people tend to drop out if they don't do well in Iowa and New Hampshire. So Iowa and New Hampshire, these two very unrepresentative states, end up
Joe
playing
Biden
an inordinately large role in determining who the president's going to be.
Yes, it's a structural thing, and I think that's part of the thing that Beard and Howard Zinn and their histories are so important about. Be impolite and ask, why does something like this exist? Dave, it's just not, the skill of our Secretary of State, Bill Gardner, jockeying with everybody. Because this could be stripped right out in a second by the DNC or the RNC. It could be stopped just like that. It has a structural function. It's functional. And what was amazing this time is that Joe Biden, who has a tremendous amount of strength among African Americans, because they know him. They know that the bad positions he might have taken in the 70s and that era and everything. But they know him. They know what to expect of him. They know him as Obama's vice president. And it looked like he wasn't going to get to that firewall, was he? This New Hampshire primary, it's ridiculous. You have the white bread mayor of some, where was he from? Mayor Pete
from
I don't want
South
to
Bend, Indiana.
Oh, and you're in Indiana, so sorry. It's a good thing and you have Amy Klobuchar, whose vice presidential hopes disintegrated with the murder of George Floyd, because that's one of the cops she didn't prosecute. And as we know, African Americans asked for a resignation after the New Hampshire primary, when suddenly she became a big candidate out of nothing. The white bread candidates do very well here, and I just launched on my show today, but we won't talk about it. That no justice, no primary, because the BLM kids are getting held.
This is kind of a footnote, but going back to Biden, I really am somewhat mystified by his African American support. I mean, I understand that he was Obama's VP, but I think his record on civil rights and race issues in general is just terrible. And also, he routinely lies about it and makes himself out to be a hero. He tells lies about having been active in the civil rights movement. He tells lies about having been arrested trying to see Nelson Mandela in South Africa, and so on.
He takes credit for everything Obama. But you know what, Dave? Because of the power of racism, this is my opinion, the power of racism to inflict harm on them. They know him. It's pragmatic, where they don't know Bernie. They didn't know Bernie. And Bernie was no politician either. He forgot to talk to Jim Clyburn and ask him to support him. He wasn't going to, but he expects to be asked. And that's Bernie. Bernie's Bernie, and I love him. I've known about it since 1974. But they understand Joe Biden. I have seen love me, love me, love me, I'm a liberal. I've been reading about how Martin Luther King actually despised, particularly towards the end of his life, white moderates, liberals, because they abandoned him in 1967 when he came out against the Vietnam War, and the diversion of money that should have gone into anti-poverty in this racist war, which he called out. they started abandoning him, and then he launched his Poor People's Campaign, probably his greatest threat of all, because to me, Martin Luther King died for his people, he died for his country, but he died for white people, he died for everybody. I mean, he mentions New Hampshire, the prodigious hills of New Hampshire in his speech, which is so shameful, like New Hampshire. And it was racism, not contrarianism. There's lots of other states full of jackasses, and well-known ones too. But you know, that it's so, because Howard talks about politeness. One of the things he says, oh well, we live in a democracy. My congressman's elected. Because it was he at that time. He'll do something for me. Oh, the president was elected. He's interested in me. Dave, until the election of 1968, in 1968, because the election is 68, that's the class of 69, which brought a lot of African Americans into Congress. Can you tell, outside of Reconstruction, do you know how many African Americans had served in Congress?
No, not offhand, I don't.
6.
Wow.
6. And those cities that had large African American populations, even in the North, people like Tommy D'Alessandro, Pelosi's father, they kept the lid on them. He was the boss, and they were a group. But yeah, what can Howard Zinn and the People's History of the United States teach us in this time that's so evocative for anybody that's lived through the 1960s and remembers it, the civil rights struggle for civil rights?
Well, I think the main thing they can learn is that significant social change for the better has to come from below, not from above. The people on the top, they're going to look out for the interests of the people on the top, and they're only going to enact changes when it is demanded from below. So you see it, for example, I mean, this is kind of a trivial example, but it illustrates the point. The reversal by the NFL on the players taking a knee during the national anthem, how, they had said they weren't going to tolerate that. They weren't going to allow that. And now, in the wake of George Floyd's murder and all of these protests and the Black Lives Matter movement, they've completely reversed course and, in fact, even apologized and said we should have, listened more to our African-American players. And we should have been more sensitive to this issue and so on. And you can think of examples of this all day long.
But Dave, Colin might be getting a job.
Obama, when he ran for president, he was against same-sex marriage. He said it was contrary to his religion.
Yes, he was.
And then when the poll numbers started changing, he said his views were evolving, like he's a real deep thinker and is really thinking about the issue. So when the poll numbers showed it was good politics for him to reverse positions, he reversed positions. And that's really how it works. So don't count on politicians. You have to force their hand by making a demand from below.
Our friend Dave Colapinto, who's no stranger to Matt and this radio show, told me, I was down at the National Whistleblower Center, before the 2012 election, that the gays, because there's all the NGOs, the non-government organizations and lobbyists down there, and everybody knows each other. They said flat out in 2011, if you keep to that position, not one single dime. Because I remember, it's like, is that what it took to get to him? Is that what it took to get to him? And yes, it is often that simple, because Julius Caesar said pecuniary power equals political power 2,000 years ago. And I was talking to the young kids last night. They said they talked to the congressman's office. They talked to the senators. They're not getting anything back. They're not getting support. What do you say about a place? We're just going to call it a place where, like, a fire department has over 250 firefighters, the contingent. Not one African American, not one woman, not one person of color, although a flamboyant politician said there might be one Latino. They have a major union, the firefighters union, that's a part of the Democratic Party with lots of money. All the people, I see them, they just talk, I'm anti-racist. There was a woman that was posting, we're having a big thing here, and we don't really want to talk about it because we can't. Think about that, Dave. Who says, oh, that's the reason I got into the race against some so-and-so, because I'm anti-racist. Well, you go to her announcement. There's not one mention of that, not one mention of anything. That's one of the reasons I was so angered by this white bread mayonnaise. I went down, put $50 I didn't really have, registered for running for the office too. And then I had to meet our mayor, who's a great person, and she's looking at me, but she knows me pretty well. I said, Joyce, I'm sorry. It was just a whim. But we don't talk about stuff like that.
We gotta wrap up in a moment.
Yeah. But Dave, I'd love to have you back on the show at your thing, because I think that teachers a great tool for teaching this generation is a people's history in the United States. Just go to a corner and start reading. And then we have the great resource, Voices of the People's History of the United States. I reconnected with Howard around that time. Funny story the Globe had, after the tapings, which were down there, in the old combat zone, they fixed it up. There was a theater there. It used to be a grindhouse, not for porno, but for some karate movies and stuff. And they were taping Voices of a People's History, and Viggo Mortensen, the actor, was very hot because, hot in his career because of the Hobbit movies, was there. And so Viggo and Howard go out to get a donut, the Dunkin' Donuts, and a woman says, Howard Zinn, can I have your autograph? And Viggo Mortensen, the Hollywood star, just ignored. And like the Globe said, that's Boston, because Howard was a star because of his morality and his honesty. I'll just say, do you have any final remarks, Professor Detmer?
No, not really. I mean, we are, as you said, we are living in really amazing times, and it's going to be interesting to see how it all plays out, and it's an opportunity for everybody to make a contribution toward a better world.
I'm just amazed, and I think Matt is too, but he's not as old as I am, to see a cop take a knee. That's a revolution. See what's going on in Minneapolis. That's a revolution. So Dr. King didn't die in vain. People that were murdered, civil rights martyrs, like in Philadelphia, Mississippi, they didn't die in vain. But we have to honor them. We have to honor them because it's amazing. That's the progress. I'm shocked at some of the stuff seen. I never thought. See a cop kneeling down. Hey, I want you on my show because I want to talk about Louis Althoza. I'm mispronouncing his name because my French, even though I grew up with it, it's worse than even my English. And we could talk about the revolutionary events of 1968 and what they meant. That would be something good. I know you're a philosopher, so Althoza, which I'm mispronouncing. How do you pronounce? Do you know French?
I do, but my pronunciation is not very good, so you're doing fine.
To me, it was Schlesinger, not Schlesinger. Okay, thank you so much, and thank you, Matt, for this time.
Yes,
because
absolutely.
We can overcome. We actually can.
All right, Professor. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye. All right, very nice, John. Thank you. I'm a little out of sorts today, a tough day, so this kind of worked out. And
good luck to you.
You kind of guest hosted for me. I appreciate it.
I didn't do too bad a job. You could see me though, chomping at the bit, wanting to go with all the little tidbits I know.
Yes.
Which drives you crazy because you'll ask me a question. Cassell told me, he says, "Geez, it's like you're giving a legal brief."
Right.
It starts going in here.
No, you did well.
Yeah.
And we'll finish out with that. I'm going to play that Phil Oakes song to close out. And I'm sure I'll be back in the saddle tomorrow. As they say. But
we can overcome any of this.
Absolutely.
And it's up to us to do it because people have shown it's possible to overcome this.
Absolutely. All right, and if you missed any part of today's show, it'll be up in just a little bit at WMNHradio.org. And don't forget to visit our sponsor, The Hop Knot, in the Brady Sullivan Plaza at 1000 Elm Street. And we'll, yeah, because you guys were talking about it, this Talking Vietnam Blues by Phil Oakes.
okay.
Yeah, we'll close with that. Thanks, everybody.